I remember the quiet after my wife's funeral more vividly than the ceremony itself. The house seemed to breathe with absence, every corner echoing with what she once carried alone. I thought grief would be the hardest part, but I was wrong. The silence was heavier than the casket. Tell me, have you ever felt that loss doesn't just take the person you loved, but also strips away the illusions you once held about your family? I had barely settled back into the routines of mourning when my son's voice broke through the stillness. He wasn't speaking of her memory, nor of the years she held us together. Instead, his eyes were fixed on the larger house, the inheritance he claimed as though love itself could be measured in square footage. That was the moment I understood. My reckoning had only just begun. The day my son spoke about the house, I was still sitting in a fog of mourning. My wife had been gone only a few weeks, and her absence pressed on me in ways I couldn't explain. The kitchen still smelled faintly of her morning tea. The closet still held her clothes, untouched. Every detail reminded me that the person who had kept the family stitched together was no longer here. That afternoon, my son arrived without a word of condolence, without even glancing at her photograph still resting on the mantel. Instead, he placed his hand on the table as if he were closing a deal. He asked when I planned to transfer the larger house to him. He said it like it was expected, like it had been decided long before. At first, I thought I misheard. My grief had dulled my senses, so I asked him to repeat himself. He did, slower this time, his voice firm, as though he believed that if he sounded certain enough, it would already be true. I sat back in my chair and studied him. His mother had carried a softness that balanced us both, but with her gone, there was no one to temper his impatience. He didn't notice my silence. He went on explaining how he needed the space, how his own family deserved more comfort, how it was time I downsized. The word cut through me. Downsized, as if I were a piece of old furniture that no longer fit the room. Reflective transition. In that moment, I realized grief doesn't end with losing someone to death. Sometimes it sharpens into a second blade when the living reveal who they truly are. I told him the house wasn't mine to give away. It wasn't simply walls and rooms. It was the place where his mother had raised him, where every birthday candle had been lit, where laughter and shouting echoed in equal measure. To him, though, it was just property. His eyes hardened, and he leaned closer. He reminded me that she had always wanted him to have the bigger home, that she believed he would need it for his growing children. He spoke with such confidence that for a fleeting moment, I almost wondered if I had missed something in all the years we spent together. But no such promise had ever been made. I knew my wife. She was generous, but she also knew fairness. She would never have reduced her love to a transaction. Suspenseful transition. Still, the way he spoke made me uneasy. It was as though he had convinced himself of a truth that never existed. I asked him to stop. I told him I wasn't ready to discuss houses or inheritances, not while her perfume still lingered in the air, but he didn't stop. He stood in my kitchen, pointing out how the bigger house would be wasted on me, how it was meant for someone with life still ahead, not a man who had already lived most of his. That was the moment I felt the full weight of loneliness. My partner, the one who would have stood beside me in that argument, was no longer here. Her absence wasn't only in the silence of the rooms. It was in the gap beside me, in the missing defense that might have softened our son's words or corrected his arrogance. Conversational transition. I wanted to believe he was speaking out of stress, or maybe fear of his own future. But the longer he went on, the clearer it became. This wasn't a momentary lapse. This was who he had become. I excused myself and walked into the living room. His mother's photograph was still on the side table. I stared at it while he spoke in the background about property values and inheritance rights. My chest tightened with a mix of sorrow and anger. Was this what she left behind? A husband lost in grief and a son chasing bricks and square footage? When I returned to him, I asked a simple question. Had he come here as a son to comfort his father, or as a claimant to lay his hands on what wasn't yet his? He didn't answer directly. He shrugged, as though the distinction didn't matter. That shrug told me more than his words ever could. Reflective transition. I sat down again, feeling smaller in my own home. I thought of the years we had sacrificed for him, the extra shifts his mother worked, the meals we skipped so he could have what he needed, the nights she stayed up sewing school uniforms. All those choices were invisible to him now, erased by his hunger for more. And then it struck me with quiet clarity. Maybe she had been the shield between us all along. With her gone, there was no buffer, no mediator. It was just me, face to face with the truth of who he had grown to be. That truth was colder than grief. That night, after my son left, the silence in the house grew heavier. I tried to distract myself by washing the dishes, but my mind replayed an very word he had said. I dried the plates slowly, one by one, as though if I stretched out the task, I could delay facing what it all meant. He hadn't come to see me. He had come to see what he believed was his. That thought stung more deeply than I expected. For years I had believed family ties could withstand anything, but now the bond between father and son felt thinner, fragile in a way I had never admitted to myself. Reflective transition. I couldn't sleep. The bed felt too wide without her beside me, and my son's words echoed in the hollow space she once filled. I lay awake until the early morning, remembering conversations my wife and I had once had. She would worry about how much we had given him, about whether he understood gratitude. I always defended him, convinced he would grow into responsibility. "He'll learn," I used to say. "He just needs time." Now, with her gone, I wasn't so sure. Maybe she had seen the warning signs all along, but out of love, she never pressed the point. The next morning, I found an envelope slipped under my door. My son must have left it before driving away. Inside was a typed document, a draft agreement for transferring the larger house to him. My hand trembled as I read it. The neat formatting, the legal phrasing, the blank line where my signature was supposed to go. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a plan already set in motion. Suspenseful transition. I knew then that this was no passing argument. He was serious, more serious than I had let myself believe. For a long time I sat at the kitchen table staring at the paper. My wife's handwriting still marked grocery lists on the notepad nearby, yet my son's typed demands pressed over her memory like a shadow. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about respect, about whether I mattered beyond the property I owned. I folded the document and placed it back in the envelope. I didn't tear it up, though I wanted to. Some part of me held back, perhaps out of shock, perhaps out of fear of what would come next. Later that day, my daughter called. She lived farther away, and grief had made her check in on me more often. She asked how I was holding up. I nearly told her everything, but the words caught in my throat. I didn't want to pit my children against each other. I didn't want to admit that her brother's concern had turned into something else. Conversational transition. Instead, I told her I was managing. That was a lie, but lies sometimes feel lighter than the truth when spoken aloud. Over the next few days, I avoided answering my son's calls. He sent messages, some short and impatient, others long and filled with rationalizations about why the bigger house should be his. I read them without replying, my silence becoming my only defense. But silence has its own cost. It gave him room to grow angrier. By the end of the week, he arrived again, this time with sharper words. He accused me of being stubborn, of clinging to something that would only burden me. His tone wasn't that of a son speaking to a father. It was that of a man addressing an obstacle in his path. Reflective transition. That was the moment I realized I could not handle this alone. I told him we would let the will speak for itself. Whatever his mother had written, whatever her intentions had been, that would settle it. For a brief second, I saw uncertainty flicker in his eyes. He masked it quickly, insisting he knew what the will contained, but I knew him well enough to recognize that flicker. He wasn't as certain as he wanted me to believe. When he left again, slamming the door behind him, I sat down with the envelope still waiting on the table. I thought about how my wife used to say, "Houses hold memories, but people carry legacy." She had believed legacy wasn't about walls or square footage, but about character. Suspenseful transition. And now I wondered, what kind of legacy had we truly left behind? I knew avoidance couldn't last forever. My silence only sharpened his determination. The typed agreement on my table had become a symbol of something larger, not just property, but the way my son measured love and obligation. When the lawyer called to confirm the probate hearing, I felt a mixture of dread and relief. Dread, because everything unsaid would soon be dragged into the open. Relief, because at least the burden of choosing would be lifted from me. The will would speak, and I would no longer be the referee between blood and resentment. Reflective transition. Still, I wondered what my wife had truly written. She was private about such matters. We had spoken about fairness, but fairness looks different in the eyes of a grieving son. The days leading up to the hearing were restless. My son stopped calling and began sending letters from his attorney instead. They were curt, lined with formal language, as though our family had shrunk down to legal phrases and signatures. It felt strange seeing our bond reduced to paper. I tried to busy myself with small tasks, fixing a loose hinge, watering her plants, cooking meals too large for one person. These tasks reminded me of her, but also of the emptiness that grew louder in her absence. Each day without her guidance left me more uncertain of my choices, more vulnerable to the pressure building around me. Suspenseful transition. The night before the hearing, I barely slept. My mind raced with questions. Had I failed him as a father? Was this his grief twisting into anger, or had these roots been growing longer than I realized? I sat in the kitchen staring at the clock until dawn. When the sun rose, I dressed carefully, putting on the same suit I had worn to her funeral. It felt like carrying her memory with me into the courtroom. As I tightened the tie, my hands shook. When I arrived at the courthouse, the building loomed over me, cold, impersonal, far removed from the warmth of a family home. My daughter was already there, waiting outside. She hugged me gently, as though afraid I might break. Her presence steadied me, reminding me I was not completely alone in this fight. Conversational transition. Then my son arrived. He didn't look at me, not even for a second. He shook hands with his lawyer instead, his back straight, his face tight with determination. The judge entered, and everyone rose. The air shifted. What had begun as whispers in kitchens and phone calls between siblings was now placed under the sterile light of law. The will was produced, sealed, and official. My heart pounded as the envelope was opened. I remembered the nights she and I had spoken quietly about our children. She worried about fairness, about leaving behind division. "I want them to remember love, not fight over bricks and wood," she had said once. I had nodded, believing love would be enough. Reflective transition. But here, in that courtroom, I realized love needed witnesses. The judge began to read. My son leaned forward, hungry for confirmation. My daughter held my hand beneath the table. Line by line, her words filled the room, her final voice guiding us even in her absence. The will did not grant him the larger house. Instead, she had split the properties evenly, with instructions that one could not be sold without both children's consent. She had tied them together, binding them with cooperation as her last demand. Suspenseful transition. The silence that followed was sharper than any outburst. My son's face froze, his eyes darting to me as though I had orchestrated it. He whispered furiously to his lawyer, shaking his head. The judge looked up and asked if there were any objections. My son's lawyer requested time to review, but the truth was clear. Her words had the final authority. My son rose abruptly, pushing his chair back with a screech, and walked out. I remained seated, the weight of her decision sinking in. She had seen more than I had. She had known this fight was coming, and she had left behind not just instructions, but a challenge. Would they honor her intent, or would greed tear apart what little remained of us? As the session closed, my daughter squeezed my hand tighter. She whispered that she was grateful for her mother's clarity, that at least now we knew where she stood. Reflective transition, but I couldn't ignore the storm still brewing in my son's silence. The courtroom emptied quickly, but the silence between us lingered. My daughter stayed close, her voice calm, urging me not to follow him. Still, a father's instinct pressed against my ribs, the urge to reach out, to salvage what little ground remained between us. Outside, I saw him pacing near the steps, his phone pressed to his ear, his words carried, sharp and clipped. I knew he wasn't just speaking to his lawyer. He was venting, twisting his grief into accusations. When he noticed me watching, he ended the call and slipped the phone into his pocket with deliberate care, as though preparing for another fight. Reflective transition. I had spent years believing that time so and anger. Yet here I was, staring at my son and seeing it harden instead, like cement poured over wounds that never healed. He walked toward me with quick steps, his jaw clenched. "You knew," he said. "You had to know." His voice wasn't raised, but it was heavy, each word a weight meant to crush. "I didn't," I answered softly. "She wrote her will in private." He shook his head. "You could have stopped her. You could have told her I deserved the big house. Instead, you sat there and let her humiliate me." Suspenseful transition. For a moment, I considered silence. Sometimes silence diffuses, but his eyes burned with a challenge. If I didn't answer, he would take my stillness as guilt. "I trusted her judgment," I said. "She wanted fairness. That doesn't mean she loved you less. It means she wanted balance." He laughed bitterly. "Balance? You gave her everything. And now she still sides with you. What do I have left?" His words pierced deeper than I expected. He wasn't just talking about property. He was talking about years, about memories where maybe he felt overshadowed, unseen. Conversational transition. My daughter stepped in then, her hand lightly on his arm. She didn't choose sides. She wanted us to stand together. That's all she ever wanted. He pulled away from her touch as if it burned. His eyes darted between us. Then he turned and walked briskly down the steps, disappearing into the flow of strangers outside the courthouse. We didn't follow. There was no point in chasing someone who had already decided to run. That night, back at the smaller house, I sat in my chair and let the quiet wash over me. The will had been read, the decision made, yet nothing felt resolved. If anything, the fracture had widened. My daughter made tea, setting the cup by my side, her presence steady but silent. Reflective transition. I thought of my wife again, how she would have handled this moment. She had a way of disarming him, of pulling back the armor he wore even as a boy. She would have reminded him of her love, of the childhood nights she stayed awake with him when he was sick, of the mornings she stood at the sidelines cheering for him when others ignored him. But now, those reminders would come only from me, and I wasn't sure he was willing to hear them. The next few days passed in a blur of unanswered calls. My daughter checked in often, worried not just about him, but about me too. She kept saying time would heal, but I saw no such signs. Instead, the letters resumed, thicker now, with legal threats of contesting the will. Suspenseful transition. Each envelope that landed on my doorstep carried a weight heavier than the paper itself. They weren't just claims. They were daggers, cutting into the little trust that remained. I took them to the lawyer, who explained calmly that his case was weak. Still, the process would drag on, each filing prolonging the conflict. My daughter urged me not to give in, to honor her mother's words as final. But deep down, I wondered if fighting him legally would only deepen the canyon between us. One evening, as I sat at the kitchen table with the papers spread before me, I remembered the night she first told me about her plan for the houses. She had been tired, her voice steady but firm. "They'll try to divide us," she said. "Promise me you'll stand for fairness, even if it breaks your heart." Her foresight unsettled me. Had she known exactly how this would unfold? Conversational transition. I closed the file and told myself I would try one more time, not through lawyers, not through courts, but face to face, father to son. When I called him, his tone was distant, but he agreed to meet. We chose a neutral place, a cafe near his office. He arrived late, dressed sharply, carrying the air of someone who wanted control of the room. We sat across from each other, the table between us feeling like a wall. "I didn't come to fight," I began. "I came to listen." He leaned back, arms crossed. "Then listen. I gave years to this family. And for what? You get sympathy, she gets to play judge from the grave, and I get scraps." I let him speak, absorbing each word. His bitterness was raw, but beneath it I caught glimpses of something else: hurt, confusion, maybe even fear. Reflective transition. When he finally paused, I asked quietly, "Do you really believe your mother thought of you as less?" He didn't answer right away. He stared at his coffee, swirling the cup slowly. "She always worried about her. She never worried about me." It was then I realized this fight had never been about houses. It had been about love, about perception, about the wounds we failed to notice until they fester. The meeting ended without resolution. He stood, leaving his coffee untouched, and said, "You'll hear from my lawyer?" Then he walked out, leaving me with the echo of his absence. The weeks that followed blurred into a cycle of letters, calls, and meetings. My son had committed fully to his case, his lawyer filing motion after motion, each one pulling us deeper into a process that felt less about justice and more about punishment. My daughter stayed close, firm in her resolve to honor her mother's wishes, but I could see the toll it took on her too. Every time his name appeared on her phone, she braced herself before answering, as though preparing for a storm. Reflective transition. I used to think disputes over inheritance were distant problems, things you read about in newspapers or heard whispered about in other families. I never believed mine would fracture like this. Yet here we were, edged into courtrooms where strangers judged the meaning of promises spoken within our home. The judge heard arguments with patience, but even she couldn't disguise her weariness. My son's lawyer painted pictures of favoritism, claiming his mother had been unduly influenced, that my daughter had pressured her. Each accusation stung, not because it had merit, but because it twisted love into manipulation. My daughter sat beside me, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She didn't speak, but I knew what she wanted to say. She wanted to rise, to fight, to shout that our mother had loved us both. But she held her silence, letting the lawyer answer with calm precision. Suspenseful transition. Every hearing ended with a temporary reprieve, never a conclusion. The delays were the hardest part, leaving us in limbo, waiting for the next strike. I began to realize this wasn't about winning for him. It was about wearing us down, forcing us to break before he did. One evening, after another long day in court, I returned home to find a package at my door. No return address. Inside was a stack of photocopied pages, letters my wife had written years ago, ones I hadn't seen in decades. My chest tightened as I recognized her handwriting, her words speaking of hope for both children, her dreams that they'd someday take care of each other when she no longer could. I sat at the table reading until the light outside faded. Each letter carried a quiet plea: unity, fairness, compassion. She had predicted the storm, but she had also left a roadmap. Conversational transition. The next day, I showed the letters to my daughter. She read them slowly, her lips pressed together. "Do you think he's seen these?" she asked. "I don't know," I admitted, "but if he hasn't, he should." Her eyes softened, though doubt lingered. "He might just say they're fake, or that you planted them." She wasn't wrong. Still, I felt something stir. The faintest possibility that if he could hear her voice again, even through paper, maybe he'd remember what mattered. I arranged to meet him without the lawyers, asking only that he give me an hour. At first he refused, but eventually he agreed, perhaps out of curiosity or simply to prove that nothing I brought would change him. We met at the same cafe. I slid the letters across the table, careful not to say much at first. He looked at them with suspicion, then reluctantly unfolded one. His eyes scanned the page, his expression unreadable. Reflective transition. I had expected anger, denial, maybe even accusations. What I didn't expect was the pause, the stillness that came over him as his lips moved silently, reading words his mother had written long before this conflict consumed us. He read 3 letters before pushing the pile back toward me. "Nice attempt," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "But words on paper don't change what she did in that will." "They weren't meant to," I answered. "They're just reminders. Reminders that her love wasn't measured in property lines." He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You keep trying to twist this into something noble, but this is about fairness, and I'm not walking away empty-handed." Then he left, leaving the letters untouched on the table. Suspenseful transition. That night I couldn't sleep. His refusal wasn't what haunted me. It was the flicker I had seen while he read. A momentary softening, quickly buried, but real nonetheless. Somewhere beneath his armor, he still carried her voice. The question was whether it would reach him in time. The case dragged on. His lawyer filed for depositions, demanding we testify again. My daughter grew weary, but stood strong, reminding me often of the promise we had made to her mother to uphold her wishes, even when it hurt. One morning, my lawyer called with news. The judge had set a final hearing, giving both sides one last chance before ruling. It was a relief and a burden at once. Relief that an end was near. Burden because whatever happened in that room would close the door on any chance of reconciliation. Conversational transition. On the day of the hearing, I dressed carefully, as though the act of putting on a suit could shield me from what was to come. My daughter walked beside me into the courthouse, her presence steady. We didn't speak much. Some silences carry more than words ever could. Inside, my son avoided my gaze, his eyes fixed on the papers in front of him. His lawyer argued with practiced confidence, insisting once more that the will had been unfair, that my daughter had benefited disproportionately. Then it was our turn. My lawyer spoke calmly, reminding the court that the will was drafted legally, witnessed properly, and reflected my wife's wishes in full. He submitted the letters as evidence of her intent, knowing they might not sway the law but perhaps could influence understanding. When the judge asked if I had anything to add, I stood. My voice was steady, though my hands trembled slightly. My wife believed in balance. She wanted peace between her children, not division. Whatever the outcome today, I ask that we remember her not as someone who caused conflict, but as someone who tried to prevent it. The room was silent. My son shifted in his chair, but didn't speak. The judge thanked us and adjourned, saying she would issue her decision soon. Reflective transition. As we left the courthouse, I felt no victory, no relief, only the weight of uncertainty. I realized then that the judgment, whatever it was, wouldn't heal us. Healing would have to come from somewhere else, from a choice my son had yet to make. That night, I placed the letters back in their box and set them on the shelf. They had served their purpose for me. Whether they would ever reach him again, I couldn't know. But I chose to believe that one day, when the noise faded, he might return to them and finally hear his mother's voice. The decision came on a rainy Thursday morning. My lawyer called me just after breakfast, his voice steady but without the usual caution lawyers tend to use when news could fall either way. "The judge issued her ruling," he said. "She upheld the will in full. Your daughter retains her share, and the claims of undue influence were dismissed." I thanked him, but my words felt heavy, like they belonged to someone else. For weeks I had told myself that the court's ruling didn't matter as much as the damage done between us. Still, hearing it was final struck me harder than expected. Reflective transition. I thought I would feel relief, some lightness after months of tension. Instead, the silence that followed the call carried a weight all its own. I knew my daughter would see this as a victory, but I also knew my son would see it as betrayal confirmed by the law. Later that day, my daughter arrived at my house with coffee in hand, her face flushed with cautious optimism. "It's over," she said, almost whispering, as though speaking too loudly might undo the ruling. I nodded, managing a faint smile. "It's over legally," I replied. "But you and I both know he won't see it that way." She sat down across from me, her shoulders slumping. "Do you think he'll cut us off for good?" I looked out the window, rain streaking the glass. "I think he already has. This will just give him a reason to make it permanent." Suspenseful transition. I wasn't wrong. Within hours, my phone buzzed with a message from him. No greeting, no build-up, just a single sentence. "You'll never hear from me again." I stared at it, half expecting another message to follow, but none came. It was final, like a door slamming shut. For a long time I didn't move. My daughter read it over my shoulder, her jaw tightening. "Maybe it's for the best," she said quietly. "He's chosen his path." But a part of me couldn't accept that so easily. Blood ties don't dissolve with a text message, no matter how sharp the words. That night, I lay awake, replaying his message in my mind. It struck me that he hadn't cursed me, hadn't accused me further. He had simply declared absence, as if the harshest punishment wasn't anger, but silence. Conversational transition. The following week, I tried writing him a letter, not to change his mind, but to leave something behind that he couldn't twist into argument. I wrote about his mother, about her wishes, about the fact that love doesn't diminish when it is shared. I ended simply, "You will always have a father who hopes you find peace." I never got a reply. Whether he read it or threw it away, I don't know. But sending it was my way of refusing to let bitterness be the last word. Months passed. Life settled into a strange new rhythm. My daughter remained close, helping me with errands, checking in often. We spoke of my wife more freely now, as though the courtroom had forced us to remember she was more than just a figure in a will. She was a woman who had built a family, however fractured it had become. Reflective transition. In quiet moments, I thought about the years ahead. I was an old man, and the truth was, time was no longer on my side. I wanted peace, not endless battles. I knew reconciliation might never come, but I also knew regret comes easily when words are left unsaid. One spring afternoon, I returned to the letters my wife had written. I chose one that spoke of hope for our children's future and mailed it to him, unsigned, in her own handwriting. Not as evidence, not as proof, but as a reminder that she had once dreamed of a life where her children leaned on each other, not against each other. Whether he kept it or burned it, I'll never know. But I believed some part of her voice might reach him where mine could not. Suspenseful transition. As for me, I found a strange kind of strength in the acceptance that not all stories end with harmony. Some end with distance, and the lesson is learning to carry on without losing yourself in the silence left behind. At church one Sunday, an old friend asked me how I was managing. I told him the truth. I've lost one child, but I still have the other. I can't spend the rest of my days chasing what doesn't want to be found. He nodded, his eyes soft. "That's not giving up," he said. "That's choosing peace." Conversational transition. In time, I began to see my life less as a fractured family saga and more as a story still being written. The chapters with my son might be closed for now, but others remained open. My daughter and I laughed more often, shared meals, and slowly rebuilt what the battle had broken. I learned to cherish what remained instead of endlessly mourning what was lost. And yet, in the quiet of evening, I still left space in my thoughts for him, not in anger, but in hope, that someday, perhaps long after I'm gone, he'll return to those letters and realize the inheritance that mattered most was never money or property, but love unbroken. I never imagined that silence could become a daily companion. After my son's final message, I expected a storm, anger, blame, demands, but instead there was only absence. At first it gnawed at me like an open wound, but over time it settled into something quieter. Not healing, not acceptance, just a kind of pause that lingered between breaths. Reflective transition. It was in that stillness that I started noticing the gaps in my own life, not just the ones left by him, but by years of pushing my own needs aside for family. My wife had carried so much of the household's soul, and when she was gone, I found myself staring at walls that no longer spoke. I realized that if I didn't find new meaning, I would spend my last years just waiting, and waiting had never changed a thing. My daughter encouraged me gently. "Dad, you've always been the one fixing everyone else's problems. Maybe it's time you do something for yourself." Her words unsettled me at first. They felt selfish, indulgent, but the more I thought about them, the more they rang true. Suspenseful transition. The first real test came one evening when I found an old box tucked in the back of the closet. Inside were my wife's journals, small, leather-bound notebooks filled with her handwriting. My hands shook as I turned the pages. Most entries were about ordinary days, meals, gardening, little frustrations with the children, but here and there were lines that pierced through. "I hope he remembers to live for himself, not just for us." That sentence stuck to me. Was it her way of speaking to me even now? For weeks I read her journals in the evenings. They weren't dramatic or confessional, but they reminded me of her quiet wisdom. Through them, I began to see that maybe the best way to honor her wasn't to keep dwelling on the fracture, but to carry forward the kind of life she had hoped for both of us. Conversational transition. I started small. A walk in the park every morning, cooking a recipe from her notes. Writing down my own thoughts in a journal, something I had never done before. My daughter joined me sometimes, and we found ourselves laughing more than we had in years. It was during one of those walks that she said, "Mom would be proud of you." I didn't answer right away. Pride wasn't something I felt, but I realized she was right in a way. For the first time since the funeral, I wasn't living only in the shadow of what was lost. I was starting to step back into life. Reflective transition. Still, my son lingered in my thoughts. No matter how many routines I built, his absence sat at the edges. I began to wonder if my growth might one day open a door back to him, not by pleading or proving anything, but by showing him, if he ever cared to see, that I hadn't closed myself off from love. There was a community center near town where older men gathered for chess, reading, and sometimes just conversation. My daughter nudged me toward it. "You need people who aren't tied up in all of this," she said. I resisted at first, but eventually I went. The first few times, I sat quietly, listening more than speaking. But over weeks, I found myself sharing bits of my story. Not the legal details, not the bitterness, just the parts about being a father, about losing a wife, about wondering how to move forward. One man, older than me, told me, "Sometimes reconciliation doesn't happen in your lifetime. Sometimes you plant seeds, and they only grow after you're gone." His words sank deep. Maybe my letters, my efforts, even my silence were all seeds, and maybe I wouldn't see the harvest. Suspenseful transition. But one evening, something happened I hadn't expected. As I was leaving the center, a familiar car pulled up across the street. My son's car. He didn't get out. He just sat there, engine running, watching. For a moment our eyes met through the windshield. Then he drove away. I stood frozen on the sidewalk, heart pounding. Why had he come? Was it accident or intention? It could have been coincidence, but my gut told me otherwise. I didn't mention it to my daughter right away. I wanted to hold it close, as though speaking of it might shatter the possibility that it meant something. Reflective transition. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept picturing his face, the way he had looked at me, not with anger, not with warmth either, but with something unreadable. Curiosity, maybe, or doubt. It gave me a strange kind of hope, though fragile. He hadn't cut me off as completely as he claimed. A part of him was still watching. So I decided to keep living, not just for myself, not just for my daughter, but in case he ever came back to look again. I wanted him to find me standing tall, not diminished by bitterness. Over time, the routines I built became less about filling space and more about finding joy again. I taught myself woodworking, built a bench for the garden, and invited neighbors over for coffee. My daughter teased me about becoming the busiest retiree in town, but she also said, I like seeing you like this. It feels like we're not just surviving anymore. Conversational transition. She was right. For the first time in years, I felt like my days belonged to me. My wife's journals still guided me. My daughter's presence anchored me, and even the silent possibility of my son's return gave me purpose. Life wasn't perfect. The fracture hadn't magically healed, but I was beginning to understand that redemption doesn't always arrive in a single moment. Sometimes it's built slowly, choice by choice, until one day you look back and realize you've been walking the path all along. I couldn't shake the image of his car idling across the street. The sight replayed in my head, not just as memory, but as a riddle. He hadn't spoken, hadn't even lowered the window, yet his presence hung heavier than any argument we'd had before. Reflective transition. I kept asking myself what it meant. Was it a step toward something or just a reminder of the distance between us? For days I moved through my routines with a quiet urgency, waiting for another sign. Each time I walked out of the community center, my eyes searched the street, but he didn't return. The silence that followed made that one brief encounter feel even sharper. My daughter noticed my distraction. Over dinner, she asked, "You seem far away. Are you okay?" I considered telling her, but part of me wanted to keep it mine. If I gave voice to it, she might dismiss it as coincidence, and I couldn't bear to have that small ember of hope snuffed out. Suspenseful transition. A week later, an envelope arrived in the mail with no return address. The handwriting was unmistakable. My son's. My hands trembled as I slid a knife along the edge. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Dad, I don't know what I expected to see when I drove by. Maybe I just wanted to know if you'd changed. Maybe I wanted to see if you were still the same man who always chose everyone else over me. I can't forgive yet, but I'm not ready to erase you either." There was no greeting, no closing, just those few lines, as raw as any conversation we'd ever had. I sat with the letter in my lap for hours. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't final rejection either. It was something in between, a thread, fragile and fraying, but real. Conversational transition. I eventually told my daughter. She leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. "That's more than I expected. He's still angry, but at least he's reaching out." Her optimism contrasted with my caution. I didn't know if this was a door opening or a trap waiting to snap shut. Still, it stirred something I hadn't felt in years. Possibility. I wrote back that night, careful with every word. I didn't defend myself. I didn't accuse him. I simply told him I was listening, that my home was open, and that I hoped one day we could sit across from each other without bitterness as the only guest at the table. Reflective transition. Days passed with no reply. The waiting gnawed at me, but I forced myself to keep living. I returned to the community center, to the garden, to the journals, but the thought of him hovered behind everything I did. One afternoon, while sanding the bench I'd been building, I realized my hands had steadied in ways my heart hadn't. The work gave me control, something clear and tangible, unlike the shifting ground of family ties. I wondered if that was part of the lesson, that not everything broken can be fixed on our timeline. Suspenseful transition. 2 weeks later, I saw him again. This time, not in a car. I was leaving the grocery store when I spotted him across the parking lot. He wasn't looking at me at first, but when his eyes landed on mine, he froze. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, almost reluctantly, he walked over. His steps were slow, guarded, but each one felt monumental. "Dad," he said quietly. Just that one word. My throat tightened. I wanted to reach out to close the gap with something more than words, but I held back. His posture told me this was fragile ground. "I got your letter," he added. His eyes flicked away, then back again. "I don't know what to do with it yet." "I don't expect you to know," I said. "I just want you to know I mean it." He nodded once, then walked past me to his car. No hug, no conversation beyond those few lines, but my chest ached with something I hadn't felt in years. Relief mixed with fear. Conversational transition. When I told my daughter later, she hugged me tight. "That's huge, Dad. He spoke to you. That's the first step." I wished I could share her certainty. To me, it felt less like a step forward and more like standing on a thin bridge that could give way at any moment. Still, I knew one thing: the distance was no longer absolute. Reflective transition. That night, as I sat in the garden, I thought about my wife. I imagined her voice reminding me that redemption isn't neat, that it often comes in fragments instead of sweeping gestures. Maybe this was one of those fragments. I didn't know if my son and I would ever find our way back to the bond we once had, but I realized I no longer needed certainty. What mattered was showing up again and again, even when the outcome was unclear. Because sometimes, the act of showing up is the only bridge strong enough to carry love across the divide. For nights after that brief encounter in the parking lot, sleep felt like something earned in scraps. I would drift off, only to wake again with his face in my mind, the way he'd said "Dad," as if it was both an accusation and a test. That single word was enough to make me realize how fragile this new beginning really was. Reflective transition. I knew that waiting for him to make the next move could drive me mad. I had spent years demanding patience from others while offering very little of it myself. Now the roles were reversed. If he was reaching out, even in small, uncertain steps, then my part was to meet him where he was, not where I wished he would be. I started with small gestures. I mailed him another letter, not long, just a few lines. "I'm here. No pressure, no expectations. Just here." I slipped in a photograph of him as a boy sitting on my shoulders at the fair, both of us grinning, like the world had no weight. I didn't add a caption. The image said enough. Weeks went by, no response. Then one evening, my phone buzzed. A message. His number. It wasn't long, just 3 words. Got the photo. Suspenseful transition. I stared at the screen until the glow faded to black. It wasn't much, but it meant he had chosen to answer. That choice alone felt like a seed planted in rocky soil, fragile, yet alive. The following Sunday, I was in the garden when I heard footsteps on the gravel path. I turned, and there he was, standing with his hands shoved deep into his pockets. My daughter had let him in without warning me, maybe on purpose. "Thought I'd see the place," he muttered. I tried to steady my breathing. "I'm glad you came." He looked around, eyes scanning the benches, the beds of herbs, the half-finished trellis I had been working on. "You built all this?" "With help. And time." There was no warmth in his tone, but no venom either. That alone felt like progress. Conversational transition. We walked slowly along the rows. I told him about how the community center had given me purpose, how people I barely knew had offered trust that once seemed impossible to earn. He listened, though I couldn't read his face. At one point he stopped at a small plaque near the garden gate. My wife's name was etched into it. His fingers brushed the metal. "You put this here?" "Yes," I said quietly. She deserved to be remembered in a place that grew life. His jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he would walk away. Instead, he took a step back, breathing hard. She would have hated what we turned into. The truth in his words pierced me. I had no defense, no explanation strong enough to soften it. All I could say was, "I know." Reflective transition. Later that evening, after he left, I sat with my daughter. She had seen the exchange from the kitchen window, though she hadn't interfered. "He stayed longer than I thought he would," she said. "That doesn't mean much yet," I replied. "It means he came at all," she answered firmly. "Don't underestimate that." Her certainty steadied me, but doubt still gnawed at the edges. I feared that every step forward might be undone by one wrong word. One old wound reopened. Suspenseful transition. The next encounter came sooner than I expected. A week later, he called. His voice was clipped, hesitant. "Dad, there's something we should talk about. The will. I don't want to hear about it secondhand." My grip tightened on the phone. The will. The very document that had split my family into factions, that had made my son feel robbed, invisible. I had avoided mentioning it for years because it symbolized every betrayal he carried. "All right," I said, trying to keep my tone steady. "When and where?" "Here, tomorrow night. Bring the paperwork." When the line went dead, I sat frozen, the letter he had written me weeks earlier still folded in my pocket. I knew this conversation could make or break what little bridge we had built. Conversational transition. The next evening, I drove to his house. My hands shook as I parked in the driveway, clutching the envelope with the documents inside. He opened the door, but didn't step aside immediately. After a long pause, he finally said, "Come in." We sat at his kitchen table. He motioned for me to lay the papers down. I slid them across, my palms damp. He unfolded them slowly, scanning each page. "You left more to her than me," he said flatly. "Yes," I admitted, "because she needed stability. You already had a career starting. She didn't." "You think I didn't need stability too?" His voice rose, sharp and raw. His weight of his anger pressed on the room. I didn't flinch. "I thought I was helping both of you in different ways, but I was wrong to make that choice without telling you. I created a wound where there didn't need to be one." For a long time, he didn't answer. His eyes lingered on the signature at the bottom of the page, then on me. Finally, he exhaled hard. "I hated you for it. For years." "I know," I whispered. Reflective transition. The silence that followed wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. It felt like standing at the edge of a river, waiting to see if a bridge could hold our combined weight. "I can't say I forgive you," he said at last, "but I'm tired of carrying all this. It's heavy." Tears pricked at the back of my eyes, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Then maybe we can start by carrying some of it together." He looked at me, long and hard, then folded the papers and pushed them back across the table. "Keep them. They're yours to deal with. I just needed you to admit it." When I left his house that night, I felt both drained and strangely lighter. The fight wasn't over, the scars weren't healed, but for the first time, the wall between us had cracks wide enough for light to get through. After leaving his house that night, I drove without direction, the documents still sealed in their envelope beside me. His words echoed louder than the tires on the road. "I can't say I forgive you, but I'm tired of carrying all this." That was not absolution, but it was something closer to honesty than we had shared in years. Reflective transition. The question now was whether my daughter and son could sit at the same table again without tearing open every wound. I had been the center of their quarrels for so long that my absence had sometimes seemed like the only peace they knew. But if I had any chance of repairing what I broke, I had to try to bring them together. The opportunity came sooner than expected. My daughter called a few days later. "Dad, he came by again. Stood in the yard, didn't come in. I think he's circling, but he's not sure what door to knock on." Her voice carried both worry and hope. I knew then the next step wasn't just between me and my son. It was between all three of us. Suspenseful transition. I suggested we meet at a neutral place, the old diner at the edge of town, the one my wife used to love. My daughter hesitated but agreed. When I called my son, there was a long silence on the line. Then, "If she's willing, I'll come. But I'm not promising anything else." The night of the meeting, I arrived first. The booths looked smaller than I remembered, the lighting harsher. I sat with a cup of coffee that went cold before either of them arrived. My daughter came in first, sliding into the booth with a tense smile. Minutes later, my son walked through the door, shoulders tight, eyes darting as if he was preparing for a fight. No one spoke at first. The clinking of dishes and low hum of conversation filled the space between us. Conversational transition. Finally, I said, I didn't bring you here to rehash the will or the past. I asked you here because I don't want to leave this life with you two carrying the weight of my mistakes." My son stared at the table. My daughter's jaw clenched, but she nodded for me to continue. "I failed your mother in more ways than I can admit in one night. And I failed you both by letting pride, anger, and fear decide how I treated you. I can't undo that, but I can own it." My son let out a sharp laugh. "You think saying it fixes it?" "No," I said. "I think saying it is the only honest place to start." Suspenseful transition. For a long time, none of us moved. Then my daughter leaned forward, eyes hard. "He has a point, Dad. You can't just sit here and confess like it's some kind of cleansing ritual. We lived with the fallout. I spent years picking up the pieces." Her words stung, but they were true. I forced myself not to retreat into defensiveness. "You're right, and I'm not asking you to erase any of it. I'm asking if we can build something different now, even if it's fragile." My son finally looked up. His eyes flicked between us. "I don't know if I can forgive you. Not yet." "That's your right," I said quietly. "But will you sit at this table again? Not to forgive me, not to forget. Just to sit?" Reflective transition. The moment stretched thin, but then my daughter spoke. "Maybe that's enough for now. Just sitting." My son gave the smallest nod. Not agreement, not surrender, but not rejection either. We ate in silence after that. The food was bland, the coffee lukewarm, but something in the act of sharing a table again felt significant. When we left, my daughter hugged me tightly. My son only offered a handshake, but it was more than I had expected. His grip was firm, steady. Conversational transition. Later that night, alone in my kitchen, I replayed every detail. The diner, the silences, the words exchanged. None of it felt like resolution, but it felt like the first breath after years of suffocation. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe that redemption wasn't about winning back what I lost. It was about showing up, consistently, without excuses, until the people I hurt could decide for themselves whether to let me back in. I folded the envelope with the will inside and tucked it away in a drawer, not to hide it, but to mark the end of its power over us. The future wouldn't be written in that document anymore. It would be written in every uneasy dinner, every tentative phone call, every fragile moment of trying again. The night after the diner, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing my children's voices replaying over and over. My son's flat tone, "I don't know if I can forgive you." My daughter's sharpness, "We lived with the fallout." Those words weren't daggers anymore. They were truths I had to live with. Reflective transition. It struck me that for years, I had avoided hearing them speak openly. I'd told myself silence was easier than conflict, that if we ignored the fractures, maybe they would seal themselves. But the diner proved otherwise. Silence only froze us in place. If anything was going to change, it wouldn't be through me alone. They had to face each other, not just me. So I called them both again. I told them this time it wouldn't be over coffee or in a public booth where eyes and ears made every word careful. I asked them to come to the old house, the bigger one, the one that had caused so much bitterness. Suspenseful transition. Neither said yes right away. My daughter hesitated, then finally agreed. My son stayed quiet for so long that I thought he had hung up. Then he muttered, "Fine, but if it turns into a shouting match, I'm leaving." The day of their arrival, I walked through the empty rooms, dust clinging to my shoes. Every corner carried memories. Laughter in the kitchen, slammed doors in the hallway, whispered arguments in the bedroom. I wondered whether bringing them here was a mistake, reopening wounds in the very place they were made. When the knock finally came, it was both of them. They didn't arrive together, but within minutes of each other. My daughter carried a guarded expression. My son carried his resentment like armor. Conversational transition. We sat in the living room, each on separate chairs. The silence grew Avi, and I realized they were waiting for me to speak first. but this time I couldn't be the only voice. "I brought you here because I'm not the only one who's been carrying things unsaid," I told them. "You both have stories I was too blind or too selfish to hear. Maybe now is the time to let them out." For a moment, neither moved. Then my daughter leaned forward. Her voice trembled, but her words came steady. "You always made me feel like second best," she said, not looking at me, but at her brother. "You were the son, the heir, the one who got the pride, the expectations, the attention. I was left to clean up, to be the helper, not the child." Suspenseful transition. My son's jaw tightened. "You think it was easy? You think I didn't feel the pressure? Every mistake I made was magnified. Every slip was a disappointment. He expected me to carry it all. I didn't ask for that. I didn't ask to be the heir." Her eyes burned into him. "Maybe not. But you played along. You took everything he gave you and acted like you were entitled to it, while I was invisible." He shot back. "Invisible? You think I didn't notice how Mom leaned on you? How she trusted you with things she never told me? You were her favorite. You just don't want to admit it." The air in the room grew charged, their words cutting years of silence into raw confession. Reflective transition. I wanted to interrupt, to mediate, to soften their blows, but I stopped myself. This wasn't mine to patch. This was theirs to say. So I sat in the ache of it, letting them spill truths I had long ignored. My daughter's voice cracked. "Do you know what it felt like, watching him scream at you, watching you scream back? Always in the middle, always the one trying to calm things down? That was my childhood, and I resented both of you for it." My son's face twisted. "And do you know what it felt like, being told to be strong, to be the man of the house before I even understood what that meant? I wasn't allowed to break down, not once. I carried his disappointment like a shadow." He pointed at me without turning his head. Conversational transition. I exhaled slowly. "I forced roles onto both of you. I didn't see the weight of them. And now you're both carrying the damage." For once, neither interrupted me. Their silence wasn't agreement, but it wasn't rejection either. "I can't rewrite the past," I said. "But maybe the least I can do now is admit I put you against each other when I should have kept you side by side." Suspenseful transition. My daughter wiped her eyes. My son rubbed his hands together, restless. "So what now?" he asked. The question hung in the air. It wasn't mine to answer. It was theirs. Finally, she said, "Maybe we try to see each other without him in the middle. Maybe that's the only way." He gave a short nod, not quite ready to agree, but no longer fighting it either. As they left the house that night, I stood in the doorway watching them. For the first time in years, they didn't walk in opposite directions. They left separately, but they paused on the porch, exchanged a brief glance, and nodded. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't healing, but it was a beginning. The fragile nod on the porch should have eased something inside me, but it didn't. If anything, it unsettled me more. They had spoken truths I had buried for decades, but words alone didn't settle the fractures that stretched through our family. The real reckoning was waiting in court, where the will, the house, and every piece of unfinished business would finally be dragged into daylight. Reflective transition. I'd avoided that moment for as long as I could. Not because of the property, but because I knew it would strip away the illusions we'd all been clinging to. The will wasn't just ink on paper, it was my late wife's voice, one none of us could interrupt or bargain with. And I wondered, as the court date drew closer, whether her words would bind us or break us completely. The morning of the hearing, the courthouse stood stark against the sky, all stone and silence. I saw my son already at the entrance, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, eyes fixed on the ground. My daughter arrived minutes later, her pace brisk, her expression unreadable. They didn't exchange a greeting. Suspenseful transition. Inside, the air was heavy with anticipation. The polished wood, the shuffle of papers, the low murmur of voices. Everything seemed to amplify the weight of what was about to unfold. Our lawyer sat beside us, composed and efficient, while the judge adjusted his glasses and lifted the sealed envelope. "This is the final testament of your mother," he said, his voice steady. "It will be read in full." My throat tightened. I braced myself. The words came slowly, deliberately. She left the smaller savings account divided equally between them. She left a few personal items, her jewelry, her letters, designated by name. But it was the house, the same house where we had argued and loved and broken apart, that carried the heaviest condition. Conversational transition. She leaves the property not to either child individually, the judge read, but to both on the condition that it cannot be sold unless both agree. Until then, it is to be maintained jointly. My son's head shot up. My daughter stiffened. Their eyes didn't meet, but I saw the same shock ripple through both. The lawyer leaned toward us. "This means neither of you has control without the other's consent. It forces cooperation, whether temporary or long-term." "Suspenseful transition," my son muttered under his breath. "She knew what she was doing." My daughter's hands gripped the edge of her chair. "Of course she did." Her voice was barely above a whisper. The judge continued, outlining the remaining assets. But the house eclipsed everything else. It wasn't just brick and mortar. It was memory, burden, and inheritance all in one. My wife had given them no escape but each other. When the session ended, we stepped into the hallway. The crowd spilled around us, voices echoing, but in our small circle, there was only silence. Finally, my daughter broke it. "So, this is her last lesson. Cooperation." My son scoffed. "Or punishment." Reflective transition. I looked at them both and realized something. My wife had seen what I couldn't. She knew neither of them would willingly choose reconciliation, not after years of hurt. So she forced their hands, binding them together not with sentiment, but with necessity. It was harsh, but maybe it was the only way forward. "I think she wanted you to face each other," I said quietly. "Not through me, not through old arguments, but through this house." For once they didn't argue, they didn't agree either, but they stood in the same silence, staring at the same reality. That evening we returned to the house together. The keys still turned stiffly in the lock. Inside, dust coated the surfaces, but the structure remained solid. My daughter walked slowly through the kitchen, running her hand over the counter. My son stood in the living room, surveying the empty walls. Conversational transition. "It's strange," she said, "how a place can hold so much at once. I hated it, but I don't want to see it either." He nodded reluctantly. "Same. It's not just walls, it's everything." I stayed back, letting them wander. This wasn't my decision anymore. This was theirs. I could only hope that my wife's final act would push them into something resembling understanding. Suspenseful transition. As they met again in the hallway, their eyes finally held. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like avoidance. It felt like recognition, not forgiveness, not resolution, but the first crack in the wall between them. I closed the door behind us, the sound echoing in the empty house. Somewhere deep inside, I heard her voice, not in words, but in the choice she had left behind. And for the first time since her death, I allowed myself to believe that maybe she knew best after all. The house had shifted from being just an inheritance to something like a test. My wife's will had left no loophole, and I could see the unease in both of them. For years, their pattern had been avoidance, quick retreats into silence, or bursts of anger that ended without closure. Now, every decision about the property forced them to sit in the same room, to weigh choices together. Reflective transition. At first, I thought the arrangement might ease them into cooperation. But what I underestimated was how deeply their resentments ran. A fresh coat of paint or an agreed repair wasn't going to erase years of blame. It only pulled the old wounds closer to the surface. The first argument came over something small, the roof. My daughter wanted it repaired properly, even if it meant hiring professionals and spending a chunk of the estate. My son insisted he could handle it himself for far less. Their words snapped back and forth like elastic stretched too tight. "Why spend money we don't have to?" he demanded, pacing near the fireplace. "Because patch jobs don't last," she replied, her arms folded tightly. "You've always wanted the shortcut, even when it costs more later." Suspenseful transition. The air thickened between them, and I recognized the rhythm. It was the same argument they'd had for years, just dressed in new clothes. He accused her of being controlling. She accused him of being careless. Neither could hear the other without dragging in the weight of the past. I stepped in, not to choose sides, but to keep the walls from closing in. "It's not just about the roof," I said quietly. "It's about whether either of you can trust the other's judgment." They both turned toward me, neither willing to admit the truth of it. But their silence confirmed what I already knew. Conversational transition. Over the weeks, these disagreements stacked up. The kitchen renovation, the garden, even the choice of furniture turned into battlefields. Some evenings ended with slammed doors. Other times the tension was so sharp that no one spoke at all. Yet strangely, even in their worst moments, they didn't walk away. My daughter would return the next morning with notes and suggestions. My son would show up with tools, grumbling but ready to work. It was as if the house itself bound them there, refusing to let either escape the responsibility. Reflective transition. I began to notice something I hadn't before. Beneath their sharp words, there was still an invisible thread, fragile but real. They remembered the same corners of the house, the same nights spent under its roof. For all their bitterness, they were stitched to the same fabric. One afternoon, they both arrived unexpectedly at the same time. My son had brought paint for the front door, while my daughter carried groceries to stock the kitchen. They collided at the entryway, both startled, both defensive. For a second, I braced myself for another fight, but instead, they froze. She looked at the paint in his hands. He glanced at the bags she carried. Something softened, if only briefly. Suspenseful transition. That night, while the three of us ate together at the old dining table, the conversation shifted. My daughter mentioned how the court ruling had felt like their mother's voice in the room. My son didn't argue. He just stared at his plate before finally admitting, "I think she wanted to make us face each other. No exits." The words lingered. No exits. It struck me then. Their mother hadn't only tied them to the house. She had tied them to the confrontation they had always avoided. There would be no easy dissolving of the property, no silent drifting apart. If they wanted freedom, they would have to work through the ruins first. Conversational transition. The following week brought a moment I hadn't expected. They tackled the living room together, removing old wallpaper. At first, it was stiff and quiet, but after an hour, the silence cracked. They began trading remarks, not kind, not entirely warm, but direct. My daughter teased him about his messy technique. He snapped back about her perfectionism. For once, the jabs carried less venom. Later, I found them sitting on the porch, both covered in dust, both laughing faintly at the sight of each other. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was something closer to what their mother might have hoped. Reflective transition. Still, I knew these fragile moments could collapse easily. Old patterns didn't disappear overnight. Each step forward carried the risk of sliding backward into familiar anger, and I wondered if deep down they both feared what true reconciliation might demand of them. One evening, as I was locking up, I overheard them in the hallway. My daughter's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of years. "I never hated you. I hated feeling like you left me to carry everything alone." There was a pause. Then his reply, rough and low. "I thought you didn't want me there. You were always ahead. I felt like I was just in your way." Suspenseful transition. It was the first time I'd heard them confess the things buried beneath their fights. Not accusations this time, but admissions. And it struck me that maybe this was the very thing their mother had planned for, to force them into a space where silence could no longer shield them. I didn't interrupt. I let their words hang in the house, the same house that had held our joys and our fractures. Perhaps it could now hold the first fragile steps of healing. There comes a moment when every parent realizes the limits of sacrifice. We spend years believing our silence, our patience, and our love will be enough to hold a family together. But silence can turn into permission, and patience can be mistaken for weakness. What I learned is that dignity is not a gift others hand us. It is something we must guard for ourselves, even when it means standing alone. My son's demands tested the very core of who I was. I thought I had faced the worst of betrayal, but life has a way of showing us just how far family can go when entitlement clouds their judgment. That day changed me, but it was not the end of the story. Because not long after, when I believed the storm had settled, the conflict reached a place I never expected, the moment my own child brought outsiders into the fight. If you want to see how quickly loyalty can turn into exposure, you'll want to hear what happened next.